Around 1998 or 1999, a young man named Eric was in his early 20s, living in a medium-sized city in the Midwestern United States. It was a time of transition, where people like him could live openly in most populous areas, but there were still plenty who held on to old prejudices. This was long before the rise of smartphones, and the internet was still in the early stages of mass adoption. While there were already large online communities, it wasn't yet common for most Americans to be connected. Socializing online mainly took place in chat rooms hosted by services like Olaya, Yahoo, or IRC servers, and message boards were still widely used. For gay men like Eric, this was nothing short of revolutionary. Before the internet and the broader cultural shifts, finding companionship often meant navigating secretive or even risky places, as expressing themselves openly was not always an option. By the 1990s, it was still somewhat dangerous, but the internet provided a new way to communicate freely and anonymously, offering a level of safety that had never existed before. Because of this, online spaces quickly became a major part of the gay community, and gay men made up a significant portion of the users on these platforms. Suddenly, it was easy and relatively safe to find dates, friends, or casual encounters, and for many, it quickly became the norm. On the other hand, with the internet being such a new tool for most people, many were blind to the risks that came with it. Eric, being a young man in his prime and not lacking in confidence, made frequent use of these online communities to find dates. In reality, that meant plenty of casual encounters. His city had a decent number of chat rooms and personals message boards, and for the most part, his experiences were positive. He met the usual mix of friendly guys, men who were still in the closet, and the occasional odd character, just as one would expect in the scene. He wasn't reckless by any means, nor did he think of himself as particularly wild. But the reality was that an attractive young man in the gay community at that time could generally find far more dates than the average straight person. At some point during this time, Eric had a brief exchange on a message board with a guy from his city. The screen name had long since faded from memory. It had been over 20 years, after all, but for the sake of the story, let's call him Slim Guy 65. Their interaction had been nothing more than a casual back and forth in a public thread within the gay section of the forum. Not in private messages, meaning anyone reading the thread could have seen it. Nothing significant had come of it, and Eric hadn't given it much thought. About a week later, however, an email arrived from an unfamiliar address. The message was brief but unsettling. It read, "Hey, I'm not gay, and I don't agree with the gay lifestyle. I'm only here because my friend met this Slim Guy 65 person from the message board, and the guy really hurt him. I don't want this to happen to anyone else. My friend tried to go to the police, but they wouldn't do anything. I saw you talking to Slim Guy 65, so just be careful and stay away from him." The message was unexpected, and Eric wasn't sure what to make of it. Eric stared at the email, rereading the words. Really hurt him. What did that even mean? Was this about a broken heart? A fight? Something worse? The vagueness of it made the whole thing more unsettling. Wanting more details, he replied to the email, asking for clarification. What exactly happened? But no response ever came. For a moment, the warning lingered in his mind, making him uneasy. But at the same time, it was just an anonymous message from someone who refused to elaborate. It could mean anything. Maybe it was just a bitter ex trying to stir up drama. Maybe it was a legitimate warning about some violent incident. Or maybe it was just a troll messing with random people for no reason at all. Eric filed it away in the back of his mind, but ultimately, he shrugged it off. Without more information, there wasn't much else he could do. Several weeks passed, and one morning, Eric found himself with a rare weekday off. With no plans, he did what he often did, turned to the internet to see if he could find some company. As he sifted through his inbox, he noticed a response to a personal ad he had posted. It was from Slim Guy 65, The message was straightforward, an invitation to come over, hang out, and have a good time. No need for explanations. The meaning was clear. There wasn't much detail beyond that, just some small talk and a casual reintroduction, similar to the brief interaction they'd had before. Nothing about Slim Guy 6'5" had really caught Eric's interest, but at the same time, no one else had reached out that day. With nothing better to do, he figured, why not? He might as well see what this guy was about. As Eric typed out his reply, his mind suddenly flashed back to that strange email, the anonymous warning about Slim Guy 6'5". Pausing, he pulled it up again and reread it. It was still just as vague as before, still raising more questions than answers. Should he really take an anonymous message at face value and just ignore this guy? He hesitated for a moment, then made his decision. I'll go check him out anyway. The address wasn't some isolated cabin in the woods. It was on a busy street in a dense residential neighborhood. If things felt off, he could just leave. He could handle himself, so he went. Before long, he arrived at the house at the agreed time. It was a duplex, one apartment on the ground floor and another on the second, part of a row of nearly identical buildings. It was the middle of the afternoon, with plenty of traffic passing by on the street and the occasional neighbor sitting on a porch or tending to their backyard. Pulling into the driveway, he parked in the small lot behind the house. With a final glance around, he got out of the car, walked up to the door, and knocked. The door opened, and standing there was a pretty, unremarkable-looking man, probably in his 40s, with a slight, slim build. He had a mousy appearance, soft-spoken demeanor, and the kind of face that wouldn't stand out in a crowd. He looked like the type who spent his days working quietly in an office cubicle, shuffling papers or typing away at a computer. Not really Eric's type, but that wasn't why he was here. His curiosity had been piqued, and with nothing better to do, he decided to step inside. As he crossed the threshold, the words from that strange email lingered in the back of his mind. He took a quick glance around, keeping his guard up, ready to gauge the situation. Eric stepped inside through the back door, entering directly into the kitchen. The first thing he noticed was how clean it was, spotless even. The countertops were completely bare, and there were no table, chairs, or any signs of daily life. It didn't feel lived in. It wasn't dirty or abandoned. In fact, it was well maintained, but it had the eerie sterility of a space that wasn't being used as a home. Glancing further into the apartment, he quickly realized why. The layout was unusual. Between the kitchen and the living room was a large window with a sliding glass pane like something you'd see in a commercial space rather than a home. Through it, he could see what appeared to be a large table set up in the living room area. Before he could ask, Slim Guy 6'5" spoke up, almost as if anticipating the question. "Oh, this isn't where I live," he said casually. "A friend of mine used to run a doctor's office here. I maintain the building for him, but it's private, though we have the place to ourselves." "Weird. Okay." Eric nodded, but something about the situation was already feeling off. As Eric stood there, feeling more and more uneasy, Slim Guy 6'5" shut the back door with a soft click and turned the lock. But this wasn't just any lock, it was a keyed deadbolt, the kind that required a key to open, even from the inside. After locking it, Slim Guy 6'5" casually slipped the keys back into his pocket, looking at Eric with a half-hearted smile. "So what do you want to do?" he asked. At that moment, Eric's danger sense shot through the roof. This was not a normal home, and the way he locked the door felt off. It wasn't necessarily suspicious. Many people had that kind of lock, and the door had a window, so it made some sense. But still, something didn't sit right. Now, with the door locked, Eric felt trapped. He needed to know more. "Why are you locking the door like that?" he asked, his voice more direct than before. The question immediately flustered Slim Guy 6'5". His face went pale, and his eyes darted around nervously as his voice became shaky, not quite stuttering, but definitely wavering. Well, we don't want someone to come in and interrupt us, right? He said, flashing a weak, unconvincing smile. Eric didn't need to hear any more. The guy's body language, the nervousness, the hesitation, the forced smile was all the confirmation he needed. There was something off about him, and whatever Slim Guy 6'5" was hiding, it wasn't good. Eric quickly realized that his presence was making Slim Guy 6'5" uncomfortable. Although he wasn't particularly muscular, he had a larger frame, always wearing size large tops and 36 waist pants. Even when he was at his thinnest, he knew how he looked to others, big. People often assumed his size meant strength, even though he wasn't really built that way. He wasn't a tough guy by any stretch, but he had a resting facial expression that made him appear far more intimidating than he actually was. To people who didn't know him, he came off as the kind of guy you wouldn't want to mess with. Eric had come to recognize this over the years, and he occasionally used it to his advantage. New acquaintances often assumed he was some kind of badass thug, which worked for him until they realized he was more of a total wimp, as he liked to joke. This, however, was one of those rare occasions where he decided to lean into that tough guy appearance. He could tell that Slim Guy 6'5" was flustered and on edge, and Eric wasn't about to let that unease go to waste. He held his posture, gave his face that hard, unapproachable look, and kept the pressure on. Eric fixed his best steely expression on his face and without hesitation said, "Unlock the door. I don't want to be locked in here." For a moment, Slim Guy 6'5" looked like he might collapse under the pressure. His eyes widened in fear, and Eric could almost see the panic setting in. But after a beat, he nodded rapidly. "Okay, all right, I'll unlock this." He quickly unlocked the deadbolt, then added, "And I'll just lock the knob here." He turned the small dial on the doorknob, securing it with a soft click. That was fine with Eric. It was a compromise, but he wasn't about to press further, at least not yet. He kept his gaze locked on the man until he added, "I'll leave the keys on the counter right here," and placed them on the countertop near the sink. Eric felt a small sense of relief, but the adrenaline was still coursing through him, his heart pounding in his chest. The tension was thick, and his mind was racing. He was almost in full fight or flight mode, but he couldn't make himself move just yet. Slim Guy 6'5" was still between him and the door, and as much as Eric felt freaked out, he knew this guy didn't seem like he posed an immediate physical threat. He had checked his pockets and noticed they were empty. The man's nervousness was palpable, and Eric could see that his size and posture were really intimidating him. He was freaking out, but not necessarily because he was physically afraid of Eric. At that moment, Eric wasn't sure what his next move should be. He could tell the situation was tense, but the way Slim Guy 6'5" was acting made him feel both unnerved and somewhat in control. Despite the detailed descriptions, everything unfolded quickly like the pace of a fast conversation. It had only been maybe 1 to 2 minutes since Eric had stepped through the door. The exchange, the uncomfortable atmosphere, and the tension all occurred in rapid succession. There were no long pauses or drawn-out moments. It was all happening in real time, building up the unease in just a short span. In that brief window of time, Eric's instincts had kicked in, and he was processing everything in a heightened state of alertness, while Slim Guy 6'5" scrambled to appease him. The urgency was clear. Every second felt like it was loaded with potential danger, and the clock was ticking. It was clear that Slim Guy 6'5" was trying his best to hide his nerves, but it was obvious. He shifted uncomfortably, almost too carefully, before saying, "Well, let's go in," and walked a wide path around Eric. Eric watched as the man made his way through the kitchen, heading into what was supposed to be the living room, then veering toward a hallway to the right. Eric recognized the layout immediately. It was a common one for that area. 2 small bedrooms with a bathroom between them, all linked by a narrow hallway. For a split second, Eric hesitated. His mind flashed to the back door, and the thought of walking out and leaving the whole situation behind. It was tempting, but something curiosity kept him rooted to the spot. At this point, he had no intention of doing anything with Slim Guy 6'5", but he was really starting to wonder what the heck was going on here. He also knew one thing: this guy couldn't take him if it came to a fight. With that thought in mind, Eric decided to follow him, though slowly. He wasn't about to rush into anything, but he was determined to see how this strange situation would unfold. So he began walking toward the living room, keeping a wary eye on Slim Guy 6'5" as he did. As Eric moved through the kitchen and into the living room, it felt like everything was happening in slow motion. His eyes immediately locked onto the large rectangular table dominating the space. It was stainless steel, gleaming in the dim light, and it took up a considerable portion of the room. At first glance, Eric thought it looked like some sort of surgical table one that could rise and tilt. There was a recessed channel running all the way around its edge, something that gave it an even more clinical, almost medical feel. In that moment, he couldn't quite place it, but it definitely seemed like a piece of medical equipment. Now, looking back, he realized what it truly was: a mortician's table. The realization hit him later, but in that moment, he could only think of it as something medical. Still, it unnerved him. Aside from the table, there were a few office-type cabinets scattered around, but those faded in significance. The table was all that stuck with him, standing out as a chilling centerpiece in that room. The large front window, which would have looked out onto the street, was completely covered by vertical blinds. They were drawn shut, blocking out any view of the outside world, creating a sense of isolation. The whole room felt more like a sterile, private space than a normal living area, adding to the growing unease in Eric's gut. Slim Guy 6'5" spoke again, his voice lacking the confidence it had earlier. "This used to be a doctor's office, like I said. Come on back here." Eric followed him into the hallway, where the layout confirmed what he'd expected. The first bedroom door was closed, and the second door, which led to the bathroom, was open. The bathroom was small, tidy, and very clean, but nothing that stood out beyond the ordinary. At the end of the hall, the last bedroom door was open, revealing a room that, if Slim Guy 6'5's story was to be believed, had once been converted into an exam room. "We can go in that room if you want. Go ahead, take a look," Slim Guy 6'5 said, staying near the closed door of the other bedroom. His voice had an odd, almost pleading tone, as if trying to offer Eric some control in the situation. The back bedroom door was open, and as Eric took slow steps toward it, he noticed the walls were covered in honey-colored wood paneling, the kind that was often found in homes or offices that hadn't been updated since the 1970s. It felt oddly outdated, like it hadn't changed in decades. Eric continued to move cautiously, trying to keep an eye on what Slim Guy 6'5 was doing behind him. He could feel the man's eyes on him, but when he glanced back, Slim Guy 6'5 didn't make a move. He remained frozen in place by the other bedroom door, watching him closely. As Eric reached the back bedroom, the first thing that caught his attention was the door, a keyed deadbolt lock, just like the one on the back door. This room locked from the outside, and though he briefly wondered if there was a lever or some way to unlock it from the inside, he quickly realized he didn't need to check to know the answer. The unsettling reality was clear enough. Inside, the room was sparse. A non-swiveling plastic desk chair sat near the center of the room, its thin metal legs creaking slightly under the weight of the stale air around it. The floor was covered in old, dark carpet, and the walls, those honey-colored wood panels, continued into this space, making it feel even more outdated, closed off, and unnerving. But what caught his eye next was the most disturbing detail. The walls were completely paneled. There were no windows. Eric knew for a fact that this room had at least one, maybe two windows, but whoever had done the paneling had gone over them entirely, blocking out any view or light from the outside. It felt like the room had been sealed off from the world. In the corner, near the wall, was an old office phone. It looked like something from the 80s or early 90s dingy beige plastic, with a row of buttons to manage multiple phone lines. It was plugged in but sitting abandoned on the floor, next to the wall, with the chair placed slightly away from it, facing the phone like someone might have been waiting for a call, or perhaps something else. There was nothing else in the room. Just that chair, the phone, and the oppressive, eerie silence that filled the space. The whole setup left Eric feeling as if he were standing in a time capsule, one that had been sealed for reasons far darker than he could yet fully understand. Eric stood at the threshold of the room, his foot barely crossing the line, but he was not about to step further in. His eyes scanned the eerie, sealed room, taking in the chair, the phone, and the walls that felt like they were closing in on him. Every part of him screamed to get out, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from the strange setup. He glanced back at Slim Guy 6'5", who was still standing by the other bedroom door. The man was smiling, but it was forced trembling at the edges, trying to appear casual, but his body language betrayed him. He was nervous, fidgeting, and there was something unsettling in the way he was watching Eric, like he was waiting for something to happen. "Well, what do you want to do?" Slim Guy 6'5" asked, his voice wavering slightly, as if the words were slipping from his lips before he could stop them. It was a question that should have felt normal, but in that moment, with everything that had led up to this, it only made the situation more unnerving. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, and Eric couldn't help but wonder what this man really wanted from him. Eric didn't answer Slim Guy 65 right away. Instead, his instincts kicked in, and he moved closer to the door, his fingers running along the backside of the deadbolt lock. As he expected, there was nothing, just the smooth wood of the door. His mind raced, his suspicions deepening with every small detail. Then, something else struck him. He looked around for a light switch, but there was nothing. No switch for the ceiling light. He scanned the room again, his gaze sharp, but nothing seemed to fit. The switch, the one that should have been just inside the door, was covered up by the paneling. It felt like the entire room had been purposefully sealed off, everything in it, down to the smallest details, designed to make the space feel even more oppressive, even more controlling. "I don't have the key to that lock," Slim Guy 65 mumbled, breaking the silence. He sounded flustered, like he was trying to brush it off, but the words only made things worse. "Don't worry about it," he added quickly, his voice shaky. The more Eric thought about it, the more his unease grew. Something wasn't right, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore the warning signs, his gut was telling him loud and clear that this situation was far worse than it appeared. Eric turned slowly to face Slim Guy 65, his heart pounding in his chest. The words were cold, calculated as he asked, "What is it that you want to do here?" His skin felt like ice, the air around him thick with tension. In that moment, everything shifted. He was no longer just standing in a strange apartment. He was standing in a dangerous situation, and the realization hit him like a freight train. As he stood there, running through every possible exit strategy in his mind, his gaze stayed locked on Slim Guy 65. The man didn't appear to have any weapon within reach, nothing obvious that Eric could see, but that didn't mean there wasn't something waiting just out of sight. The room, the locked doors, the strange setup, it was all starting to add up to something far darker than anything Eric had been prepared for. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper as he demanded, "What are you trying to do?" The question hung in the air, pregnant with the weight of a dozen unsettling possibilities. The tension in the room was suffocating, and for the first time since entering, Eric truly began to fear what might happen next. Slim Guy 65 was clearly caught off guard by Eric's direct question. His face twitched, and for a moment, he seemed completely derailed, struggling to come up with any kind of answer. His voice came out in stammers, barely coherent. "Some hot man-to-man fun?" He forced a smile, but it was the weakest, most awkward expression Eric had ever seen. The man's eyes darted nervously, like he was teetering on the edge of panic, and Eric could practically feel the tension in his entire body. It was obvious that Slim Guy 6'5" wasn't prepared for this line of questioning. Whatever game he had been playing, whatever twisted situation he had set up, it was now slipping through his fingers, and his anxiety was practically palpable. The more Eric observed, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a guy looking for a hookup, it was something far more off-kilter, and Slim Guy 65 was unraveling under the pressure. Eric's instincts screamed that this was the exact moment to make a move before things could escalate further. The words, "some hot man-to-man fun," hung in the air, but it wasn't the content of the sentence that unsettled Eric. It was the way Slim Guy 65 said it. The desperate, awkward, and completely unconvincing way he stammered those words. It was as if he was scrambling to come up with something, anything, to salvage the situation, but instead, he only exposed how far out of his depth he was. There was nothing natural about it. No one says that in real life, not like that. It sounded like a line ripped straight from a sleazy ad, something forced and out of place. The smile that followed was hollow, twitching at the edges, and the quivering lips only added to the bizarre, unsettling nature of it. The moment was almost absurd in its awkwardness, but in reality, it was probably the most chilling part of the whole experience for Eric. In that instant, everything clicked. Slim Guy 65 wasn't just some guy hoping for a casual encounter. There was something more sinister at play here, something lurking just beneath the surface. And that weak, trembling smile? It was a mask slipping, revealing the panic underneath. Eric's instincts screamed that this man was hiding something, and the way he stammered those words only confirmed it. It was like the final crack in the facade, and Eric knew, deep down, that the situation was far worse than anything he could have imagined when he first walked in. That was it. Eric had enough. The weirdness, the anxiety, the sense that something was horribly off, it all came crashing down. With a firm resolve, he said, "Nope, I want to go. I'm leaving." There was no more hesitation. He was done. Slim Guy 65 hesitated for a moment before muttering, okay. But Eric wasn't sticking around to see what else might unfold. He quickly moved past him, watching as the man awkwardly flattened himself against the wall, clearly trying to avoid any confrontation. Eric's adrenaline was at full throttle as he made a beeline for the kitchen, heading straight for the back door. Thankfully, the deadbolt was still unlocked, and the keys were right where they had been left on the counter. Without a second thought, Eric pushed through the back door, stepping out into the yard, not even bothering to shut it behind him. He could see Slim Guy 65 moving slowly toward the door behind him, but Eric didn't look back. His heart raced, but he didn't run. He deliberately walked, each step firm, but measured. He needed to keep his cool. As he reached his car, Eric stole a glance back at the building. The sense of wrongness was still crawling over him. There, just as he had suspected, was a window facing the backyard area from that room. But it was covered up from the inside, obscured by the paneling. His heart sank as he realized just how much had been hidden in that place. Slim Guy 65 was shutting and locking the back door behind him. Eric didn't look back again. He got into his car, started the engine, and drove away, every nerve in his body on high alert, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief as the apartment grew smaller in his rearview mirror. Eric's mind raced as he drove away, his heart still pounding in his chest, his skin chilled to the bone. What the hell had just happened? His thoughts were a whirlwind of questions, none of them with clear answers. He could feel the tension of the moment still gripping him, unable to shake the feeling that he had narrowly escaped something sinister. Was that guy a killer? That question lingered, but it was too early to know for sure. The setup, though, it was deeply unsettling. Slim Guy 65 had access to a sterile-looking apartment with a mortician's table, a place clearly not meant to be a home. That alone raised far too many red flags. But it wasn't just the table. There was the windowless room, the one that locked from the outside, and the chair positioned directly in front of an old office phone. No light switch to be found. What kind of setup was that? Eric couldn't help but picture it. Someone getting locked into that room, the lights going out, and them left in darkness alone, isolated. The phone was the only connection to the outside world, but for what? Who knows? Maybe it was some twisted game Slim Guy 6'5" liked to play, with the unfortunate person left in that room, forced to call, to play whatever role he had scripted for them. The idea was enough to make Eric's stomach turn. He couldn't help but think back to the warning email from the person who had claimed to know about Slim Guy 6'5's past. The friend who had allegedly been hurt, probably some poor soul who had been trapped in that very room. Eric shuddered, hoping he had gotten out just in time before anything more could unfold. Whatever had been going on in that apartment, it wasn't normal. It wasn't a simple hookup. It was something far darker. And for the first time in a long time, Eric felt truly grateful to have walked away from it. As Eric drove home, his mind churned with the aftershock of the experience. His heart was still pounding, but as the minutes passed, his thoughts became more focused. Should I call the police? The question echoed in his mind. He thought about it, running through the scenario in his head. The problem was, when he tried to break it down, he realized there was no clear crime to report. Sure, the apartment had been strange, almost disturbingly so, but what could he tell them? He had gone there for a casual encounter, and everything up until that point had been consensual. Slim Guy 6'5" hadn't touched him, hadn't threatened him. He just seemed odd, but weirdness alone didn't constitute a crime. He'd seen the room with the chair, the mortician's table, as he now thought of it, and the other unsettling details. But was that enough to raise suspicion? Would the police even care? Eric thought about calling an anonymous tip line, but even that felt useless. What exactly could he report? That a man had an oddly sterile apartment with old office furniture? That the place looked like a strange cross between a doctor's office and a morgue? It didn't add up to anything the police could act on. Without concrete proof of illegal activity, there was no way for them to take action. Then, his mind turned to the nature of the local police. While they were generally decent, they weren't known for prioritizing issues concerning the gay community. In the 90s, things weren't as progressive as they were becoming now, and Eric knew firsthand that police weren't always interested in getting involved in cases where there wasn't an obvious crime or arrest to be made. He'd heard stories about cases being dropped or ignored simply because they involved LGBTQ+ individuals, or because there was no immediate evidence of wrongdoing. So after some internal debate, Eric made the difficult decision not to call. He didn't have enough to go on, and he couldn't be sure the police would take him seriously. Instead, he just drove home, feeling a mix of relief, confusion, and unease. He was safe for now, but the questions lingered, unanswered. What was really going on in that apartment? And who, exactly, was Slim Guy 6'5"? Eric made the decision not to report the incident, thinking it over carefully. He realized that if he did call the authorities, it would only bring unwanted attention to himself. At the time, the environment for the LGBTQ+ community wasn't as open and supportive as it might be today. If he had reported it, what would he even say? The police might have brushed it off as just an odd encounter, or worse, turned it into something that could jeopardize his privacy. Looking back, he thought his choice was probably the most rational one he could have made. In hindsight, he knew that in today's world, where there is more awareness and sensitivity to LGBTQ issues, things might have played out differently. The law enforcement today might have taken him more seriously, perhaps investigating the man's home with a different set of eyes. But back then, it was a different time, and Eric wasn't willing to risk it. So he moved on, wiser and more cautious. He'd learned from the experience. knowing that some situations are best walked away from without a second glance. And in this case, he'd gotten out before things could take a darker turn. For several years after the incident, Eric continued to drive past the house, his mind lingering on the memory of what he'd experienced there. Each time he'd glance at the property, his curiosity piqued by its quiet and unnerving appearance. The vertical blinds that had been so consistently drawn during his visits stayed shut for about 5 or 6 years. It was as though the house itself was holding on to a secret, much like he had, leaving him to wonder who might have been in there after him. Eventually, one day, the blinds came down. They were replaced with decorative curtains, signaling that the house had likely been sold to someone new. Eric assumed the place had finally found a new owner, one who was going to live in it, not maintain it like the man who had once lived there. For a while, he felt a sense of unease whenever he passed by, but as time went on, the house faded into the background of his daily life, no longer the site of an encounter that had once been so chilling. The memory remained, though one of those unsettling moments that shape who we are and make us more aware of the world around us. Eric's heart sank as he recalled the news report. The details of the young man's murder were haunting, and the story struck a nerve. The familiarity of the face on the screen, someone he recognized from the local gay community, though they weren't close, was unsettling. He felt a chill as he remembered the whispers of a possible serial killer that had circulated among friends. The news report hadn't mentioned anything about a gay bar or a string of similar disappearances, but Eric couldn't shake the sense that there might be a connection to the strange experience he'd had years earlier. The story he'd heard from his friend was even more chilling. Several young men had gone missing over the past year, all last seen at the same dive bar. Each had been found several miles north, just across the state line, in isolated areas. The pattern in the murder Eric had seen on the news seemed to fit that same disturbing rhythm. His mind raced. Could the man from the duplex, the one who'd made him feel so uneasy, have been involved in something darker? The thought made his stomach turn. Eric couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the house he'd visited was connected somehow to this string of crimes. But the location of the murders, out in the country, was far from the duplex where he'd met SG-65. He tried to reassure himself that it was just a coincidence, but the coincidence felt too eerie to ignore. Years passed, and despite his suspicions, Eric never heard anything conclusive about the murder, or whether it was connected to the broader pattern. The gossip about a serial killer seemed to fizzle out, leaving only a vague sense of unease in the community. No official word came down, no investigations made headlines. It was as if the mystery had faded into the ether. But for Eric, the unanswered questions lingered. That one strange afternoon he'd spent in the duplex, the man's unsettling demeanor, the mortician's table, the locked rooms, they all returned to haunt his thoughts every now and then, especially when he'd see the news or hear of another strange disappearance.